Imagine this. You're standing on a sheet of ice in the middle of nowhere. Antarctica stretches endlessly in every direction. White, frozen, silent. Your ship, your only way home, has just been crushed like a tin can by the pressure of the ice surrounding it. You watch as the vessel that carried you here disappears beneath the surface, swallowed by the frozen sea. You have no radio and no way to call for help. No one on Earth knows exactly where you are. The nearest human settlement is over 1,200 miles away, across some of the most hostile ocean on the planet. You have 27 men looking at you, waiting for you to tell them what to do next, waiting for you to tell them they're going to survive this. What would you do? This isn't a thought experiment. This was the reality facing Ernest Shackleton and his crew on November 21st, 1915. And what happened next, over 497 days of impossible survival, would become one of the greatest leadership stories in human history. Here's what makes this story remarkable. Not a single man died. In an era before GPS, before modern rescue equipment, before satellite phones, when being stranded in Antarctica meant almost certain death, Shackleton brought every single person home alive. But this isn't just a story about survival. It's a story about leadership when everything goes wrong. It's about maintaining hope when logic says there is none. It's about the choices one person made that meant the difference between life and death for 27 others. Because here's the thing most people don't know, Shackleton never reached his goal. The expedition was, by its original measure, a complete failure. They never crossed Antarctica. They never achieved what they set out to do. But what Shackleton did instead, keeping every man alive through nearly 500 days of hell, became far more important than any geographic achievement could have been. This is the story of what happened when everything that could go wrong did go wrong. When nature threw every possible obstacle at a group of men who refused to give up on each other. When a leader had to make decisions no one should ever have to make. This is the story of the Endurance expedition. And it begins not with disaster, but with hope. In 1914, Ernest Shackleton was already a celebrated polar explorer. He'd come within 97 miles of the South Pole in 1909, closer than anyone before him. But Roald Amundsen had reached the South Pole in 1911, and Robert Scott had died trying to do the same in 1912. The race to the South Pole was over. But Shackleton had a new vision, to cross Antarctica on foot, from sea to sea, traversing the entire continent. No one had ever done it. It would be the last great Antarctic journey of the heroic age of exploration. He called his expedition the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition. The ship he purchased and renamed was called the Endurance, taken from his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." Shackleton was 40 years old. He was charismatic, confident, and absolutely convinced he could do the impossible. Those who knew him describe him as a man who could inspire loyalty like no other. He had a gift for understanding people, for knowing what they needed to hear, what they needed to feel, to keep going. The crew he assembled was handpicked. 27 men, each chosen not just for their skills, but for their character. Shackleton famously interviewed candidates with unusual questions. He wasn't just looking for sailors and scientists, he was looking for men who could handle isolation, hardship, and each other. There was Frank Wild, his second-in-command and trusted friend. There was Frank Worsley, the captain of the Endurance, a brilliant navigator with an almost supernatural ability to read the sea. There was Tom Crean, a veteran of Scott's expedition, tough as iron. There was the ship's carpenter, Harry McNish, skilled but stubborn. There was the photographer, Frank Hurley, who would document everything. And there were the younger men, scientists, sailors, even a stowaway named Pierce Blackborough, an 18-year-old who would become the youngest member of the expedition. They set sail from South Georgia Island on December 5, 1914. World War I had just begun in Europe, but these men were heading to a different kind of battlefield, one made of ice and wind and endless cold. For the first month, everything went according to plan. The Endurance pushed south through the Weddell Sea, navigating through pack ice, making steady progress. The men were in high spirits. They sang songs, played games, told stories. They were explorers on the adventure of their lives. But by mid-January 1915, the ice began to thicken. The Endurance slowed. Then, on January 19th, the ship became stuck, completely surrounded by pack ice, unable to move. At first, no one panicked. Ships getting temporarily stuck in ice was normal. They'd wait for the ice to break up, for leads of open water to appear, and they'd continue south. Shackleton remained optimistic. They were so close, just 85 miles from their planned landing point. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The ice didn't break, instead, it tightened. The Endurance was trapped, drifting slowly northward with the pack ice, completely at the mercy of the frozen sea. The men settled into a routine. They kept busy, maintaining the ship, conducting scientific observations, playing football on the ice, caring for the sled dogs they'd brought for the crossing. Shackleton knew that keeping morale up was critical. He organized entertainment, concerts, competitions, lectures. He made sure the men stayed active, stayed connected, stayed hopeful. But beneath the routine, a terrifying reality was building. The ice around them wasn't just frozen water, it was a living, moving force. The flows shifted constantly, driven by currents and winds. And when those massive sheets of ice collided, they created unimaginable pressure. The Endurance was being squeezed. By October 1915, 10 months after becoming stuck, the pressure was becoming unbearable. The men could hear the ice groaning, could feel the ship shuddering as the ice pressed against its hull. The wooden timbers creaked and cracked. The Endurance was built to withstand ice, but no ship could withstand this forever. Shackleton watched his ship suffer. He knew what was coming. He'd seen it before, had heard stories of ships crushed by ice, their crews lost. He began to prepare the men for the possibility they might have to abandon ship. Supplies were organized, lifeboats were made ready. Emergency camps were planned. On October 27, 1915, the ice won. The pressure became too much. The Endurance's hull cracked, water began pouring in. The ship was dying. Shackleton gave the order, abandon ship. 28 men stepped off the Endurance onto the ice, watching as their only way home was slowly crushed and consumed by the frozen sea. On November 21st, the Endurance finally sank beneath the ice, taking with it their dreams of crossing Antarctica. They were stranded on a moving ice floe in the middle of the Weddell Sea, hundreds of miles from land, with no way to communicate with the outside world. They had 3 lifeboats, limited supplies, and winter was coming. Most leaders would have despaired. Most men would have given up hope. But Shackleton made a decision in that moment that would define everything that came after. He gathered his men and told them simply, "Ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." Not "we might go home." Not "we'll try." We will go home. And in that moment, a new mission began. The goal was no longer to cross Antarctica. The goal was to survive, and to make sure every single man survived with him. The first challenge was immediate. How do you keep 28 men alive on a sheet of ice that's constantly moving, breaking apart, and drifting in the wrong direction? Shackleton established Ocean Camp, a temporary settlement on the ice floe. They salvaged what they could from the Endurance before it sank. Food, equipment, the 3 lifeboats. The lifeboats were critical. They were the only things that could carry the men across water when the ice eventually broke up. But those boats were heavy. Each one weighed over a ton, and they'd have to drag them across the ice when the time came. The men set up tents. They rationed food carefully. They killed some of the sled dogs for meat, a heartbreaking necessity that devastated the men who'd cared for them. Shackleton knew every calorie mattered. Every decision about food was a calculation about survival. The daily routine was grueling. Temperatures dropped well below zero. The ice beneath them was unstable. It could crack open at any moment. Men took turns on watch through the night, alert for any sign of danger. Frostbite was a constant threat. So was the psychological weight of their situation. What would you think about, stranded on ice, knowing your ship was gone? Some men thought about their families. Some tried not to think at all. Shackleton made it his mission to keep their minds occupied. He organized games, encouraged conversation, maintained as much normalcy as possible. But beneath the routine, everyone knew the truth. They were drifting north with the pack ice, but slowly. Too slowly. At this rate, it could take years to reach open water. And their food wouldn't last years. It wouldn't last months. Shackleton faced an impossible calculation: stay on the ice and drift, or try to march across the ice toward land. In December 1915, Shackleton made the call. They would try to march to Pallet Island, where he knew there was an emergency supply cache left by a previous expedition. It was 346 miles away across broken, shifting pack ice. It seemed like the only option, but it turned out to be one of the hardest decisions the men would face. They set out, dragging the lifeboats and supplies across the ice. Imagine pulling a 1-ton boat across rough, broken ice in sub-zero temperatures. The ice wasn't smooth. It was a landscape of pressure ridges, cracks, and obstacles. Every mile was agony. They managed 7 miles in 7 days. 7 miles at that rate, reaching Pallet Island would take months they didn't have. The physical toll was destroying the men. They were exhausted, frostbitten, starving. Shackleton made another decision. They would stop. They would set up a new camp, Patience Camp, and wait for the ice to break up beneath them. They would let the drift take them north and hope they eventually reached open water. It was called Patience Camp for a reason. Now their survival depended entirely on waiting, on enduring, on maintaining hope while doing absolutely nothing but drifting slowly through a frozen hell. For 4 months, they waited. Christmas came and passed New Year's. The ice beneath them cracked and reformed constantly. Their floe got smaller as pieces broke off. They moved their camp multiple times as the ice split beneath them. Shackleton watched his men carefully during this time. He knew the greatest danger now wasn't cold or hunger. It was despair. He rotated sleeping bags so everyone got a turn in the warmest ones. He made sure the weaker men got slightly larger food rations. He organized sing-alongs and storytelling sessions. He kept them human. But by April 1916, nearly 17 months after the Endurance first became stuck, the food was almost gone. The ice was breaking up faster. They couldn't stay on the floe much longer. And that's when the ice finally gave them a chance, and their greatest test. On April 9, 1916, the ice floe they'd been living on began to break apart. Open water appeared, stretches of dark sea between the ice floes. It was terrifying and hopeful at the same time. Water meant danger, but it also meant possibility. Shackleton gave the order, launch the boats. 28 men climbed into 3 small lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, and pushed off the ice into the freezing Antarctic Ocean. Their target was Elephant Island, a desolate, uninhabited rock about 100 miles to the northwest. It wasn't much, but it was land. Solid ground, somewhere they could rest and regroup. The boat journey should have taken a few days, it took 7. 7 days of rowing through rough seas, between icebergs, in open boats. Imagine being in a small wooden boat, crammed with 9 other men, soaked to the skin, freezing, exhausted, rowing through waves that could capsize you at any moment. Ice formed on the boats. Men's hands froze to the oars. They couldn't stop rowing. If they did, they'd freeze to death. At night, they couldn't sleep. They'd drift between ice floes, terrified of colliding with one in the darkness. Some men developed frostbite so severe they'd lose toes later. Others suffered from saltwater boils, painful open sores from constant exposure to seawater. They had limited fresh water. They sucked on ice to stay hydrated. They ate frozen rations, and they rowed. Hour after hour, day after day. Frank Worsley, navigating with a sextant in a pitching boat, somehow kept them on course toward Elephant Island. It was nearly impossible, taking a reading from a moving boat through waves, with frozen instruments. But Worsley was brilliant. He got them there. On April 15, 1916, 497 days after the Endurance became stuck in ice, they landed on Elephant Island. For the first time in over a year, the men stood on solid ground. They collapsed onto the beach. Some kissed the rocks, some cried. Some just lay there, too exhausted to move, but Shackleton didn't celebrate. Because he knew a truth the others hadn't fully realized yet. Elephant Island wasn't salvation. It was barely habitable, a barren, windswept rock with no vegetation, no animals, no resources. They'd escaped the ice, but they were still stranded. No one would look for them here. No one knew where they were. If they stayed on Elephant Island, they would eventually die. Shackleton stood on that beach and made the most audacious decision of the entire expedition. A decision so bold, so desperate, that even his closest companions thought it was suicide. He would take one of the lifeboats, the James Caird, and sail 800 miles across the Southern Ocean to South Georgia Island, where there was a whaling station. Where there was Help Point 800 miles. In a 22-foot wooden lifeboat, across some of the most dangerous ocean on Earth. Shackleton chose 5 men to come with him: Frank Worsley, the navigator; Tom Crean, the toughest of the crew; Second Officer Tim McCarthy; Carpenter Harry McNish, who reinforced the James Caird with wood from the other boats; and able seaman Vincent and McNish. The James Caird was modified as best they could, decked over to provide some protection from the waves, loaded with supplies for the journey. It was still a tiny boat about to attempt one of the most treacherous ocean crossings imaginable. The 22 men staying behind on Elephant Island understood what this meant. If Shackleton didn't make it, no one would ever come for them. Their survival depended entirely on 6 men in a tiny boat reaching South Georgia. Frank Wild, left in command of the shore party, gathered the men and told them simply, "The boss will come back. He always does." On April 24, 1916, the James Caird pushed off from Elephant Island into the Southern Ocean. What followed was 16 days of hell. The Southern Ocean is infamous among sailors, home to the largest waves on Earth, storms that appear without warning, and conditions that sink ships many times larger than the James Caird. And they were attempting this crossing in autumn, as winter approached, in a boat barely bigger than a car. The waves were mountainous, 50, 60 feet high. The James Caird would climb the face of a wave, balance on the crest, then plunge down the other side, out of control. Water poured over them constantly. They were always wet, always freezing. Ice formed on the boat, threatening to capsize it with the added weight. They had to constantly chip away the ice with whatever tools they had. They worked in rotating shifts, 2 men steering, 2 men on the sails, 2 men resting. Except rest was impossible, you couldn't lie down. You couldn't get dry, you just sat there, wet, frozen, exhausted, trying to survive until your next shift. Worsley navigated using the sun and stars, except the sun and stars were rarely visible through the thick clouds. He got maybe 4 readings during the entire 16-day journey. He was navigating mostly by dead reckoning, calculating their position based on speed and direction, compensating for wind and currents, all while being thrown around in a tiny boat. One mistake, and they'd miss South Georgia entirely. And if they missed it, there was nothing but open ocean for thousands of miles. They rationed food and water carefully. Each man got small portions twice a day, cold, barely edible meals. Fresh water was scarce. They melted ice when they could. Thirst was constant. The cold was indescribable, Antarctic cold that seeped into your bones, into your soul. Men couldn't feel their fingers or toes. Frostbite was inevitable, but they couldn't stop. They had to keep sailing, keep steering, keep surviving. On the 8th day, they hit a massive storm. Waves larger than any they'd seen, the wind screaming. Shackleton wrote later that in that moment, he saw a wave so large he thought it was a clearing in the sky. Then he realized it was water, about to break over them. Somehow, impossibly, the James Caird rode over it. One of the men said later that he felt a 7th presence in the boat during the worst moments, something beyond the 6 of them, something helping them survive. Shackleton felt it too. He wrote about it afterward, the sense that they weren't alone out there. On May 8, 1916, through the mist and rain, they saw land South Georgia Island. Worsley had navigated them across 800 miles of the Southern Ocean in a 22-foot boat, through storms and waves, and hit the island. They'd done it, except they hadn't. Not quite. They'd landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling stations were on the opposite coast. Between them and rescue was a mountain range that had never been crossed. They were too weak, too exhausted to sail around the island. The seas were too rough. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean decided to do the impossible one more time. They would climb over the mountains. A 36-hour march across glacier and peaks with minimal equipment, no map, and barely any strength left. The 3 men set out, leaving the others to rest. They climbed for 36 hours straight, without stopping to sleep. They fell through snow bridges, navigated cliffs in the dark, slid down glacier when climbing down would have taken too long. At one point, they sat down to rest and realized if they fell asleep, they'd freeze to death, so they didn't sleep. On May 20th, 1916, they walked into the strongest whaling station on the far side of South Georgia. The whalers didn't recognize them at first. They looked like ghosts, emaciated, bearded, covered in filth. When Shackleton identified himself, the station manager was shocked. The world had given up the Endurance expedition for dead over a year ago. Shackleton had made it. He had crossed the Southern Ocean in a lifeboat and traversed an unmapped mountain range. But his job wasn't done. 22 men were still stranded on Elephant Island, waiting for rescue. Shackleto's first words to the whalers were simple: "We need a ship now." The 3 men stranded on the other side of South Georgia were picked up first. Then Shackleton turned his full attention to Elephant Island, to the 22 men who'd been waiting for months in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. But the pack ice was still thick around Elephant Island. 3 separate rescue attempts had to turn back. The ice was impassable. Each time, Shackleton watched the ship retreat, knowing his men were still waiting, still believing he'd come back. On Elephant Island, Frank Wild maintained routine and discipline. Every morning, he woke the men with the same words: "Get your things ready, boys. The boss may come today." Every single morning, for over 4 months, the same message of hope. The men survived on seal and penguin meat. They lived under 2 overturned boats for shelter. They endured Antarctic storms, freezing temperatures, isolation, and the creeping fear that maybe, just maybe, Shackleton hadn't made it. But they believed, because Shackleton had told them he'd come back. And Frank Wild kept that promise alive every single day. Finally, on August 30th, 1916, on his 4th attempt, Shackleton broke through the ice on a borrowed Chilean vessel, the Yelcho. As the ship approached Elephant Island, he stood on the deck, counting the figures on the beach. 1.2. 3. He counted every man, dreading that someone might have died while he was gone. 22. Every single one was alive. When the men on the beach saw the ship, they couldn't believe it. Some thought they were hallucinating. Then they realized the boss had come back, just like Wild said he would. The rescue took less than an hour. Every man was evacuated. As the Yelcho pulled away from Elephant Island, heading north toward civilization, Shackleton finally allowed himself to feel what he'd been suppressing for nearly 2 years. Relief. Overwhelming, complete relief. They'd survived, all 28 of them. The Endurance expedition never crossed Antarctica. It never achieved its original goal. By the measure Shackleton set out with, it was a complete failure. But what Shackleton did instead became legendary. He kept 28 men alive through 497 days of impossible circumstances. Not because he was the strongest. Some of his men were tougher physically. Not because he was the most skilled sailor. Worsley was the better navigator. But because he understood something fundamental about leadership that most people never grasp. Leadership isn't about reaching the goal. It's about bringing everyone home. When Shackleton returned to England, World War I was still raging. The world barely noticed his survival story. There were bigger headlines. Some criticized the expedition as wasteful. Others called it a failure. But the men who survived never saw it that way. In later years, when asked about Shackleton, they all said the same thing: he saved us. He never gave up on us. Tom Crean, the tough Irishman who'd crossed the Southern Ocean and the mountains with Shackleton, wrote simply, "Shackleton was the greatest leader that ever came on God's earth, bar none." What does Shackleton's story teach us? It teaches us that leadership in crisis isn't about inspiring speeches or grand gestures. It's about the small decisions, making sure everyone gets a turn in the warmest sleeping bag, noticing when someone's spirits are flagging, maintaining hope when there's no logical reason for hope. It teaches us that sometimes the goal has to change. Shackleton's goal was to cross Antarctica. When that became impossible, he didn't give up, he changed the goal. The new goal was survival. And he achieved it completely. It teaches us that caring for people isn't weakness, it's the ultimate strength. Shackleton's success came from his genuine concern for every single man under his command. He knew their personalities, their limits, their needs, and he adapted his leadership to meet them where they were. Most importantly, it teaches us that in our darkest moments, when everything has gone wrong, when the ship has sunk and we are standing on the ice with no way home, that's when our real character emerges. That's when we find out what we are actually made of. Shackleton's men faced a situation that should have killed them. Statistics said they shouldn't have survived. Logic said it was impossible. But they did survive, because one man refused to accept that any of them wouldn't make it home. When you face your own impossible moments, and you will, because life throws them at everyone, remember the endurance. Remember 28 men on a sheet of ice, 1,200 miles from anywhere, with no ship and no hope of rescue. They survived because they refused to give up on each other. You have that same strength. Maybe you don't have to cross the Southern Ocean in a lifeboat, but you face your own storms, your own tests, your own moments when the ship sinks and you have to figure out what comes next. Shackleton's lesson is simple. When everything goes wrong, you change the goal, you adapt, and you keep moving forward. You take care of the people depending on you. You maintain hope even when logic says there isn't any. And you never, ever leave anyone behind. The endurance is gone, crushed by ice and lying at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. But the story lives on because it shows us something essential about human nature. We are capable of far more than we think we are. In the right circumstances, with the right leadership, with the right commitment to each other, we can survive anything. Where are you watching from? And more importantly, have you ever faced a moment like Shackleton's? A moment when everything went wrong, but you found a way through. What kept you going? What did that experience teach you about your own endurance? Drop a comment below. I read every single one, and I genuinely love to hear your story. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about leadership, about survival, about what humans are capable of, please hit that like button and subscribe. We release new stories about transformative moments in history every week. Real people, real challenges. Real lessons for our lives today. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to this story. And remember, when your own ice closes in, when your ship sinks, when everything seems impossible, you're stronger than you know, Al.